So I call this message the clinical and economic value of caring. So now it's time for something completely different. First, though, I'm going to tell you a story. So on February 27, 2007, on a snowy stretch of highway outside of Uppsala, Sweden, 2 commuter buses packed with passengers collided head on. And this is what was left of one of the buses. You can imagine what the scene was like at the hospital. Tragically, 6 people lost their lives, but miraculously, 56 people were saved. About 5 years later, researchers studied these 56 survivors. In a study that is, in my opinion, unlike anything else that I've seen, they wanted to know what was their experience. And so they asked them, and they recorded it, and they used a rigorous qualitative research methodology to analyze every word that they said and to pull out any themes that were available, any commonalities in what these survivors said. They found 2 themes. One was expected. The other definitely was not. So the first theme that they found was the physical pain that they experienced at the moment of impact. That was expected. The one that wasn't, the common theme in these 56 survivors, a lack of compassion from the caregivers at the hospital. Now, this was 5 years later. That's what they remembered. So I'm an intensivist, so I practice critical care in an ICU. I meet people on the worst day of their life. That's what I do for a living. And now, after data like this, I think, after all the healing is done, what are my patients and their family members going to remember about the way I cared for them 5 years later? Now, you might be thinking, these people were just unlucky because they got taken to some rogue hospital where nobody cared. But here's the kicker. In this study, these 56 survivors were taken to 3 different hospitals. And the effect that they saw, the theme in the data, was independent of the center to which they were taken. They all had the same experience. The available data in the biomedical literature suggests that we're in the midst of a compassion crisis. Literally, a crisis. So what are the other data? Recently, a 1,300-person survey study in the U.S., both patients and physicians, found that more than half of patients and physicians did not think that the U.S. healthcare system consistently provided compassionate care. That was despite the fact that 3/4 of patients and physicians believed it was so important for treatment success that they answered yes to the question, could it be a matter of life or death? Another study in the U.S., 1,400 patients, 2/3 of them indicated that they had a meaningful healthcare encounter with an absence of compassion. Similar survey study data is available in Ireland. Similar survey data is available from the National Health Service in the UK. And in one especially well-done study, very rigorous methodology, where the investigators actually measured everything the physician said to patients, they concluded that 0.4 to 0.6% of physician statements to patients were statements of compassion, less than 1%. So based on that available data, I conclude we are in the midst of a compassion crisis. But here's the important question. Does that matter? I'm not asking the question to be provocative. I'm being serious. Does it matter? Now, some of you are nodding your heads as if, of course it matters. Well, I don't think anybody in the room would question the fact that we ought to be compassionate to patients. There's an ought there. There's a responsibility. But is it just an art? Is it in the art of medicine where it's just a responsibility a moral imperative? Is it in the art, or is it in the science of medicine, where there are measurable, evidence-based effects of compassion on patients, health care, and those who care for patients? It could be debated. I wanted to know the answer. I'm a physician scientist. I went to the data. And for the past year, I have been trying to answer this question: does compassion really matter? And I'm going to share with you some of those things that I found. So recently, there was a systematic review published in the literature that found that there are more than 50 potential mechanisms of action for compassionate healthcare, meaning mechanisms of action where they could benefit patients or benefit patient care or benefit those who care for patients. Some of those were physiological. For example, neuroendocrine system effects or autonomic nervous system effects, or just modulating stress-mediated disease. Some of them were very practical. For example, physicians that care more may be more meticulous about the care they're providing, may have higher quality standards, and may have fewer medical errors. Some of these mechanisms of action had to do with communication. If you have a compassionate relationship with your patient, maybe they'll actually tell you more information, more self-disclosure. They'll tell you what's wrong with them, and maybe you'll do a better job of listening to that information. And better self-care. There's data that actually patients who are in a compassionate relationship and believe that their physician actually knows them as a person, they actually take their medicine. So on this slide behind me, there are a lot of data. The red text indicates the effect size or the measurements or the magnitude, but all of these findings were statistically significant. And interestingly, broadly, across a number of healthcare domains. For example, better control of blood glucose and cholesterol and diabetes, better control of symptoms in irritable bowel syndrome, lower risk of a low birth weight infant for at-risk mothers, lower doses of pain medication needed after surgery, more likelihood to adhere to a treatment regimen, better chance of actually getting your function back if you're in rehabilitation, lower levels of detectable virus in the blood in patients with HIV, and even an effect on the duration and severity of symptoms in patients with the common cold. I find all of this compelling. I could have made many slides that look just like this. These are some that I find particularly interesting that I wanted to share with you. This is the human toll, but what about the economic? There's also clearly an economic value to caring. And if you think about it in this way, in terms of resource utilization, if you are in a relationship with a patient, a strong doctor-patient relationship, maybe it makes sense that they have lower unnecessary referrals to specialists, lower use of diagnostic tests, lower unnecessary admissions to the hospital. Maybe if we just spend our time talking to them, we don't actually need these things. But this is not the major economic impact. Actually, that is a mixture of the economic toll and the human toll. Those that care for patients, you and me. So the hallmarks of burnout are emotional exhaustion and depersonalization. When you put those two things together, what do you get? You get compassion fatigue. And we are very much aware that burnout is real and that burnout is of epidemic proportions across the globe, including the United States. But this takes a huge economic toll as well, because in the healthcare industry, people are leaving their profession in droves, and of those that remain, there is higher absenteeism, and there is higher employee turnover, people going from place to place. And burnout is cited as one of the major reasons. Now, the classical thinking, this is the classical thinking, is that investing yourself in patients is emotionally taxing, and it can raise your risk of burnout. So in the past year that I've been reviewing all this data, what I found is nothing. There is not one compelling shred of evidence that I've been able to identify that actually supports that in a rigorous way. Actually, there's data to the contrary. Now, you may say, I know that there's data that shows high burnout, low compassion, low empathy, but you're assuming causation there when there's only association. Maybe it's actually the other way around. It's not that burnout crushes compassion, crushes empathy. Maybe it's people who have low compassion and low empathy are predisposed to getting burned out. And that's actually what the preponderance of data in the medical literature actually supports. That connecting with patients, human connection, compassion, building those relationships can actually build resilience, can actually be protective against burnout. So I'm a clinical scientist, I do research, and I like to do experiments. So I decided to do an experiment. And in this experiment, I had an N of 1. So that 1 was me. And so that's where we mix the science and the personal. So about 2 years ago, I came to a stark realization. And that stark realization was I had almost every symptom of burnout. Looking around and playing the odds, I'm probably not alone. And for those of you who know what I'm talking about, you know that's not a good place to be. What do? I didn't know. So I looked around. What's in the literature? That's my go-to. So I went to the data. It said, pull back. Spend less time at work. Get away. Go for a nature hike or whatever. I mean, those things sound good, right? It sounds good. But I wasn't buying it. I mean, I just don't buy it, right? Because those things maybe could be helpful, but I think that the antidote to burnout has to be at the point of care. Not escapism, which is what I think of those other things. Not escapism. It has to be at the point of care. So I knew that there was this data on compassion and resilience, and I knew it was there, so I did an experiment, my N of 1. So for the past year or so, I've made a conscious decision. And when you make a conscious decision, you have to work at it, right? You don't just flip a switch. Lean in more, not less. Talk more, not less. Care more, not less. Sit down more, but don't just sit down, actually connect more, not less. Sometimes when you're driving home, wow, you're exhausted from all of this. But you all know what I mean when you say it's a good tired, right? And that was when it began to change for me. And that fog began to lift, and it transformed everything. So I don't know if you would have that same experience in your N of 1, but if you're experiencing those symptoms and you think you're going down that route, I suggest that you test this hypothesis for yourself. So I ask you this question, does compassion really matter? Is it just the art, or is it in the science of medicine? 1 year of data, an unbelievable, just vision-blurring number of studies behind me now. I can tell you with confidence, I believe that compassion is better for health through better patient outcomes, health care by improving quality and financial sustainability, and better for healthcare providers. So I'm going to leave you just with one more thing, one piece of data, because you might be saying to me, I get it, I buy it, but I'm really busy in my practice. I mean, I don't have time to be compassionate. You're not alone. A recent survey study showed that 56% of physicians said the same thing. I don't have time to be compassionate. I'm going to try to change your mind about that. I want you to remember one piece of data, the number 40. Okay? So a randomized controlled trial published in the oncology literature, 210 patients, most of whom had breast cancer. And they were randomized to two groups, a control and an experimental arm. The cancer patients, the primary outcome was the anxiety in a cancer patient. And if you're a cancer patient, it's a pretty important outcome measure. So in the control arm, they got exposed to a scripted consultation from an oncologist. Literally, scripted and recited by an oncologist. And in the experimental arm, they got the same exact script plus just a little bit more scripting. What they found was that the experimental arm had substantially and statistically significant lower anxiety in those cancer patients. And I think that's a striking outcome. So what was the intervention? What was the scripting? I could tell you, but instead I'm just going to read it to you. So before the consultation started, I know this is a tough experience to go through, and I want you to know that I am here with you. Some of the things that I say today may be difficult to understand, so I want you to feel comfortable in stopping me if something I say is confusing or doesn't make sense. We're here together, and we're going to go through this together. And immediately after the scripted consultation, I know this is a tough time for you, and I want to emphasize again that we are in this together. I'll be with you each step along the way. What was a piece of data that I asked you to remember? So how long did it take for that extra piece of scripting? 40 seconds. So 40 seconds can change everything for your patient and for their experience. 40 seconds changed everything for me and my experience. So that's the power of 40 seconds. Thank you.